Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
I think that by 2023, Hillary Clinton will be the president. I'm going to go on the record with that.
It's incredibly aggressive, and it seeks out exactly the sort of cultural triumphs of the West that are sort of most delightful to everybody, because those are the things that they want to claim and make objects of cultural contestation so that they can own them. I mean, famously, of course, art is exactly the football that political factions use to take control of reality.
Conservatives, too, experience this kind of anxiety of ambivalence where, they want to reclaim the culture, but the culture seems sort of exhausted, and they want to reclaim the institutions, but the institutions suck. And I feel certain that, below the papery layer of officialized celebration that we are seeing come out of the woke champions of the institutions is this kind of deep melancholy that why is it that we're only in charge when these things are sort of slipping into obsolescence?
It's 2022, and it is far past time that America had a multiple personality disorder Supreme Court justice. And if they can get that through, then they can argue that there actually have already always been 20 justices.
Look, as far as the Supreme Court, I just have one thing to say. I mean, I think Nicole Hannah-Jones should definitely be the nominee. She should be confirmed, be placed on the court. It's her time, and she deserves it.
Welcome, everyone, to the Roundtable, the Publishers and Editors podcast here at the American Mind at the Claremont Institute. I'm your host, Ryan Williams, publisher of the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind, president of the Claremont Institute. I'm joined by Matthew Peterson, founding editor of the American Mind, James Pullis, executive editor of the American Mind, Spencer Clavin, features editor of the American Mind and associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books, and Seth Barron, managing editor of the American Mind. Well, I wanted to open today with some discussion of a few items that all kind of fit together. The common theme is our continuing descent into wokeism and its effects on our culture, our educational system, our criminal justice operation, and our entertainment industry, and just our general national pathologies. First, this announcement from Jordan Peterson that he's leaving a full professorship at the University of Toronto. I mean, the headline kind of explains all that he wants to convey, and go read it. Of course, it's interesting. It's a nice polemical piece, but the headline is Jordan Peterson, Why I'm No Longer a Tenured Professor at the University of Toronto, and the subhead is The Appalling Ideology of Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity. That's just demolishing education and business. A companion story, and this is not new, but we've been talking about this a little bit, but I think the leading indicator of this, or the leaders of this, was the University of California system, which is abolishing the SAT as a requirement for admission. Their excuse is that critics say, critics of the SAT, this is in the subhead, critics say the tests put less wealthy students at a disadvantage. You can get some people, our friend actually, Inez Stepman, used to tutor SAT, and she said sort of at the margins, thousands of dollars worth of prep could raise scores just a bit. But I think the consensus has been for a long time that the SAT is a pretty good measure of general intelligence, and general intelligence is thought to be one of the stronger predictors of success, future wealth, and all the rest, and a lot of this psychology literature. So, we all know why the SAT has to be abolished. It's because it stands in the way of the admission of enough minority students. For whatever reason, that seems to be the case, especially when viewed through the lens of disparate impact. The fact that you can't get perfect representation in your college with all the minority groups means you must be doing something wrong and something racist, even if you don't know it. And so that must be the SAT. Next, we have this, and I will tie all these together after this, I promise. Next, we have this interesting piece from Barry Weiss's Substack Common Sense, written by Peter Kiefer and Peter Svodnik, about Hollywood and its woke turn. In September of 2020, I'm just going to read a couple sections of this because it's pretty interesting and absurd. The Academy, that is the motion picture, what the hell is it called? Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, of course, launched its Representation and Inclusion Standards Entry Platform, or RAISE, always a good acronym, is a good start. For a movie to qualify for Best Picture, producers not only had to register detailed personal information about everyone involved, but the movie had to meet 2 of the Academy's 4 diversity standards, touching on from everything from on-screen representation to creative leadership. An Academy spokesperson said only select staff would have access to data collected on the platform. The Academy explained that movies failing to meet these standards would not be barred from qualifying for Best Picture until 2024, but producers are already complying. In 2020, data from 366 productions were submitted to the platform. Meanwhile, CBS mandated that writers' rooms be at least 40% Black, Indigenous, and people of color for the 21-22 broadcast season and 50% for the 22-23 season. ABC Entertainment issued a detailed series of inclusion standards. I'd guarantee you every studio has something like that, a longtime writer and director said. Skipping a few paragraphs down. Of course, Hollywood, like many industries, does have a clubbiness about it. And pretty much everyone on the inside insists it should open up to those who had for decades been kept out. But the heavy-handed mandates, the databases, the shifting culture, and pretty much all white men were assumed to have gotten their jobs because they had the right tennis buddies, or zip code, or skin color, raised the possibility of a new kind of clubbiness. When asked whether, that sentence is not important, few more paragraphs down, all of which may explain the very strange story of the brand new $484 million Academy Museum of Motion Pictures. This is actually at the end of the piece, so not a few paragraphs down, but like 10 pages later. In September, the Academy threw a gala celebrating the opening of the museum. Attendees included Sophia Loren, Guillermo del Toro, Jennifer Hudson, Issa Rae, Orlando Bloom, and Katy Perry. Lady Gaga performed. Vogue covered it the way Vogue covers things. Ted Sarandos, a co-CEO of Netflix and the chair of the museum's board, gave a speech. This is great. Some of you will be familiar with this practice, now very common in faculty meetings across the land. In what is now common practice in places like Los Angeles, an elder from the local Tongva tribe kicked things off with a blessing and land acknowledgement. That's where you acknowledge that you're on the land of stolen from Native Americans. The sanitation worker whose job it was to clean the podium between speakers dutifully wore his mask. The speakers did not. It goes through, the ridiculous and lavish giant theater that's in there, but then this. Oddly, it's missing any mention of the small band of mostly Jewish emigres from Eastern Europe who created the film industry, the people without whom there would be no entertainment industry. In today's climate, in which inclusion and diversity are said to be so important, it was an especially ironic omission. Jews were excluded from almost everywhere. Anyway, this is a high irony, but I think it's explained in part by this next piece, which I found from the ADL's Twitter feed, that is the Antidefamation League, and here's just the top line of that. ADL Collaborative for Change Fellowship offers Jews of color opportunity to share their stories. New York, January 26th. The Anti-Defamation League announced today the inaugural class of Collaborative for Change Fellows, Jews of color who will receive up to $25,000 to counter bias and hate through film, research, and other projects. This fellowship seeks to expand awareness and understanding of how anti-Semitism and racism overlap and intersect, key term, in ways that are uniquely harmful to Jews of color. What crops up in this, and then when we were talking ahead of this, Seth pointed out that this is increasingly seen across the woke institutions. There's this emerging notion of Ashkenazi privilege because they've been so dominant, I think, especially in America. I mean, most of the Jews who founded Hollywood, to throw back to the Barry Weiss article, were Ashkenazi. So they're basically, these Jews are now too white, it's seen. So there's a new emphasis on Jews of color. And so the intersectionality movement helps to confuse us even more about how we ought to think about identity and oppression and oppressors. And then finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about these two cases that don't seem related but are in a way, and that's this insane murder in East Harlem. Well, I guess all murders are insane, but this kind of lunatic homeless black man shot this poor Latino girl. And then when they were cuffing him and taking him to the van, he was screaming things like, where's our reparations for 400 years of fucking slavery? Fuck you all. America's gonna burn. finally, I just want to bring up the final data point, which is that the Supreme Court decided to take the affirmative action case from Harvard, where a bunch of Asian students and associations are charging discrimination, arguing that the numbers demonstrably show that if they were let in by merit, their representation would double or even triple at Harvard. And it's been a systematic pursuit in recent years in favor of students of color that are not Asian. So what is all of that? I mean, what ties all this together? I think it was a nice basket of why wokeism is destroying Western civilization. It seems to me we're in the arts and sciences, you're experiencing a kind of reverse renaissance. Part of the point of that Hollywood piece is that this is leading to a kind of Soviet Stalin-esque environment where all of the white writers and especially writers, they're sort of featured most prominently there, are living in fear. They're not sure what they can say on calls. They behind closed doors, a lot of them just think, and their agents are telling them, yeah, you didn't get that one. Sorry, they were looking only for people of color, couldn't do anything about it. Producers are telling the same things to folks behind closed doors. And so, I mean, our colleges are going down the tubes because meritocracy is now racist. Are not that we need to be huge uplifters of Hollywood here, but it seems like major cultural institutions, even outside Hollywood, will start experiencing this kind of decline as well. One data point in that, which I hadn't pulled up, but I just recall, forever in symphonies, and Heather McDonald's written about this a lot, you audition blind in symphonies, and blind auditions were producing too few musicians and symphony participants of color, so they're ditching blind admissions in a lot of places. So not just low ideological Hollywood art that's going to suffer because talent will be squeezed out in favor of skin color, but also higher art like symphonies. Good professors like Jordan Peterson are leaving higher education because it's an environment in which excellence is no longer rewarded, and good scholarship is thrown over for ideological claptrap produced by people with the right skin color. And then you have the twin of resentment, higher stakes resentment, crazy lunatics who think that the kind of narrative coming out of establishment actors, especially on the left, about systemic oppression, racism, et cetera, will justify acts of murder. It's not, look, this guy was crazy and maybe he's just trying to justify it after the fact. Of course he was. But I think this is increasingly true. You stoke enough racial resentment and bad things will happen. We can just put it that way. Then the lower stakes version is what Clarence Thomas talked about a long time ago in his memoir and elsewhere, which was, he came out of Yale and he couldn't get a job at any law firm. He had to go work for Senator Danforth, luckily for the country that put him on a path to the Supreme Court. But he said, the rise of affirmative action meant that all black degrees, when they're out in the world, are now tainted. And you see the flip side of that in that Hollywood piece, which is, even if it's not true in some cases, a lot of the white writers who've been displaced, even when they're not given the explicit reason, being their skin color, they just conclude that because of the change in Hollywood. So none of this bodes well for our future. But I think I'll just end on this positive note. I think it provides a huge opportunity another piece of the populist appeal. And you see some success of this with Glenn Youngkin and others railing against critical race theory. I think a huge plurality, if not majority of America, thinks this is all still crazy. And so we ought to be unafraid to call it crazy and to support candidates who do, and to encourage leaders to push back against it.
That's all very interesting stuff. I mean, the business with the Hollywood Museum and the Jews who founded Hollywood not being included. I mean, this seems to be like consistent across the board. This idea that, here's what it is. Everything that is the creation of like quote unquote white civilization, which would include, Jews and increasingly Asians, that's just sort of taken for granted, right? Like, it's not that Jews created the movie industry. They just sort of took it over. Same way whites didn't create America, they just took over what was here. Chemistry is not like a creation of, the combination of certainly Arab influence, but European mastery of 19th century principles of material physics, but it's something that exists independently that whites have seized. And you can go on and on and on. The space program. Well, it's not that white America went to the moon. That would have happened anyway. They just kind of forced everybody else out of the way and used their brilliance and labor to do it. Slaves built America. So, I think this is, but, it doesn't work the other way. Like everything great that, like, blacks have made basketball terrific. They made, they took Western instruments and made them great. Well, okay, yeah, that's true, certainly, in a certain way. But, I guess it comes down to this whole thing of like, cultural appropriation versus assimilation, like forced assimilation. I don't really know where I'm going with this, but just, it comes back to this whole parallax of celebration. Like what's considered like worthy of celebration and what's like disgusting. So it's very interesting, the idea that like we have to celebrate, I don't know, whatever the Native American influence on the movie industry is, while ignoring the people who actually created the movie industry. It's a very nice sort of really crystallizes, I think, the whole project that's going on across the nation. But I know I'm going on and on here, but I just want to say, I guess I feel, you want to sort of get mad about what's happening in universities in Hollywood, but when were they ever on our side? Who was the last great Republican in Hollywood? Barbara Stanwyck? Okay, I guess there's others, but like conservatives.
Yeah.
Hollywood has been against us forever. The universities have been against us forever. So, if they want to like dissolve themselves,
yeah,
kola kavod.
We won't shed many tears,
as some would say. Right, yeah.
Yeah, well, forget cultural appropriation. It's cultural dispossession is what you're talking about, Seth. It's just the kind of arrival on the scene of not, by the way, it's not in the name of actual black people or actual people of color, or whatever that demographic means. As always, it's in the name of a political coalition, certain group of basically radical oligarchs who believe that they're going to take control of the entire world using technology that can perfectly identify and count every person according to whatever bean counter mechanism they've come up with now, whatever data they're going to collect from the movie studios and the universities to arrange people just exactly according to their specifications. And yeah, it all hinges on this idea that like the actual baseline of Western civilization, of the university system, of Hollywood, like all of that comes from nothing. It's just an empty space that's ready to be colonized, which, is kind of is supposed to be the grandeur, right, of some of these, great cultural products, is they're supposed to be, quote unquote, for everyone. And the point of this movement, this new cultural movement, is for these particular oligarchs to rise up and say, no, that's for me, that I own that. And you can see it happening in stuff like, I know this is petty, but you watch Apple TV Plus has this adaptation of Foundation, the great Isaac Asimov series. It's one of the triumphs of science fiction, and it's about like nerdy autistic white guys doing math. Basically, it's like a giant parable for the power of mathematics. And they've of course recast the two main leads by Black Girl Magic as these strong, powerful black women prodigies. And so that ends you up in this position of being like, well, those people weren't black, which is really not what it's about. It's about this aggressive act of cultural dispossession. Like, this is ours now. This is not a symbol for Asimov's vision. This is not, and they did the same thing with H.P. Lovecraft. Like, Lovecraft was a racist, and so now we're going to recast his stories as social horror about the racism of white people. It's incredibly aggressive, and it seeks out exactly the sort of cultural triumphs of the West that are sort of most delightful to everybody, because those are the things that they want to claim and make objects of cultural contestation so that they can own them. I mean, famously, of course, art is exactly the football that political factions use to take control of reality. It's what Socrates does in the Republic when he exiles the poets and establishes his own mythos, his own story of national justice and how the world ought to be organized. And he does that because he recognizes exactly how art works. It kind of creates this cloud, this atmosphere of assumptions that you can't think your way out of, so that everything just looks the way the party in power wants it to look. And yeah, I mean, luckily the internet makes it kind of impossible to really accomplish that, because people can see outside of it and see through it and laugh at it and mock it. But also digital technology makes it possible, as I'm sure James would articulate much better than I, to accomplish this kind of task with a high degree of specificity and hostility.
Yeah, I mean, there is something genuinely sad and disheartening about this, putative majority moment in Hollywood and academia and elsewhere, where it's sort of like, your turn to hit the piñata is after the piñata has already been burst open and the last piece of candy has been stolen away from the ground. It's conservatives too experience this kind of anxiety of ambivalence where, they want to reclaim the culture, but the culture seems sort of exhausted, and they want to reclaim the institutions, but the institutions suck. And I feel certain that, below the papery layer of officialized celebration that we are seeing come out of the woke champions of the institutions is this kind of deep melancholy that, like, well, why is it that we're only in charge when these things are sort of slipping into obsolescence? And they are. And so, underlying all of this is just kind of this fundamental question about cultural renewal. Where does culture come from? How do we build it again? How do we make it fresh and imbue it with life and do so in a way that, that retrieves and sustains what has come before in what is, after all, a quite new world in so many ways. This is not an easy question to answer, much less on a podcast, but it begins with people accepting that they're going to have to suffer in order to bring those kinds of things into the world. There's so much desperation right now, even among really good, really talented, really successful people. This feeling that, like, everything's melting, and if I don't just get rich as soon as possible, then I'm not going to make it. I'm not going to survive. Not going to make it over the zombie wall. And it's tough because in some ways that seems to be increasingly true. Like, increasingly, I mean, this goes back to Alexis de Tocqueville, who's like, yes, Americans are obsessed with money. Actually, money is more important in democratic times. So that goes away to explaining why. But people feel, even high earners have a very low net worth, and people feel like, they can't count on anything except that, it's still better to have more money than less money. But even if that's the case in some, relatively narrow or even fairly broad sense, that is not, you can't map that onto the challenge of creating new culture. I think new culture is a huge growth opportunity right now, and it can attract lots of money. But the reason why you do it, the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning, the thing that makes you suffer and struggle to bring such a thing into the world, is not a money motivation. It's a different kind of motivation. In most cases, beyond even politics, partisan politics, although these fields intersect. It's hard to kind of like sit on the shoreline and watch all of these institutions just kind of inexorably sink into the sea. But if you turn around, I think, people will see that in spite of all the insanity, there are a lot of green pastures. And if there's a purpose that you feel in this world, and if there's something within you that you feel can be a testimony to something greater and more enduring, you got to just start building yourself. Otherwise, what we're seeing right now, we're going to continue to see, which is people taking over America who are insisting that no, in fact, they're the real Americans, even though their regime takes away the natural referent that was present at the founding and even before the founding of America, and takes and swaps out the divine referent for an entirely new theology and ultimately a new God.
Yeah, let me just jump in. I mean, this whole this whole idea of what culture is, I think is just worthy of meditating on if you're listening in the audience, because listening to what James is saying, he's saying that the new thing, I mean, it'll be a completely different kind of thing. What's obsolete in a way is the movies, right? Is the TV shows in the way that you thought of them before. And there's whole new forms of culture that undoubtedly will be built. And it's not clear what form that takes, because it's not clear, how this period ends. But the idea that culture means, large corporations telling stories to people that they sit and watch on screens, fairly new. Definitely has old echoes of old things that people have always liked. But there's a lot of different forms that culture can take moving forward, and there's whole new realms that just don't even exist yet. That would be much more meaningful. But behind all that is something deeper, something philosophical, something theological. And I guess the main point is I want to just go back to the article Ryan was talking about. The main point is to say it was never neutral. All of this was always political. The power of mass media over the last century was always utilized by large-scale powers and state actors. So if you don't think that's true, you need to rethink. This isn't new, what's going on now, but it has metastasized in certain ways. And so, stars, movies, et cetera, you had political and, larger forces pushing certain things rather than others, realizing that these players strutting about the stage were insanely powerful. And it's a hidden sort of power, because most people don't know who's putting the stars together or who's really greenlighting the stories and the talent and the myth that you're making with movies. But what you do see is obviously there's much more in the way of shared premises and shared purposes for, say, what America is and should be. In the past, there was, even a lot of the trends we see now were there was a lot of shared premises about what good and bad are actually in the past. And so all stories teach you ethics, and they teach you ethics about what's right and wrong in the most serious of ways. You don't really learn what's right and wrong through logic. You learn it through stories, through actual examples, and that's why parents tell fables to their kids in any culture. And so this is always fraught, but there was more agreement. Now there's not. And the interesting thing, as everyone's been pointing to, is this thing is eating itself. So media is eating itself. And this article, which is fantastic, I mean, let me just say, for a lot of us, right, we're very close to this. And I talk to people all the time who, you're plenty of libs in Hollywood, right? More than half of the people who work there are terrified. They're absolutely terrified. They're living through a cultural revolution. A lot of them can't describe it, but what's happening is bizarre if you don't think of it in terms of a cultural revolution. And it's destroying any kind of art, any kind of semblance of what you would think entertainment would be, because it's a rigid ideology that operates by punishing people. And so, the whole point at the beginning, it makes total sense. It's a great point. You have this museum where you miss the most obvious persecuted minority story you could tell about Los Angeles and the whole media industry, because the focus is on the propaganda of the moment. And I do think it's good that it's breaking down. There are new forms in the future, but I think in the transitional period, there's still an opportunity to break talent out, to make things that people would actually like in kind of a radio-free style that people would gravitate towards. And of course, I'm engaged in that on the other side of the fence. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there to grab talent, people who, aren't necessarily even conservative, but if you can generate revenue, they will work and they will produce some amazing stuff. And in the meantime, how should you think about it when you see all this falling apart? I mean, there is a certain element of, they're getting what they deserve. But I think someone needs to explain to the old liberals why they're getting what they deserve. Like there's an essay to be written and saying, to these older guys who recognize that the woke stuff is batshit crazy. There's an article written explaining this is how what you have always been about led, to this madness. And I think that's actually an interesting topic. And I don't think it's as clear as all that. I mean, an old school lib, at least in the way a lot of these people thought of themselves, they didn't think of themselves as about the kind of radical racial ideology of the wokes today. And so I think there is a good deal of understandable confusion. And it would be a good idea to walk some of them through how this happened. That's still a story that needs to be told.
Yeah, it's of a piece with one of our themes, Matt. It's the transformation of civil rights. Caldwell's two constitutions, one pre-64, one post-64. And it's even in that article, too. They said, Hollywood's always been, since mid-century at least, a little longer even, at the vanguard of the latest, progressive causes. They cited a gentleman's agreement, talking about excluding Jews from stuff. They talked about Poitiers and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and the issue of blacks and whites in America. But then they then they quote a bunch of people who are like, but we think maybe it's gone too far now. And I think what a lot of people don't understand is how it went so far and how it went so far so quickly. And it has to do with an older notion of sort of equal protection, civil rights, and the new notion, which is that really, and it's rooted in the rejection of truth and objective reality and everything else. If everything's about narratives and power, then it's about shaping these narratives of past oppression and subjection and using it to your advantage. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think that studios want 50% black writers. Blacks are 13% of the population. And I don't think they're overwhelmingly gravitating towards script writing. And that's just one small example, but
we just break in there. Like that example is fantastic, but just to just heighten it. I mean, what no one will say right now, for instance, is that there's lots of white actors, right, who are like watching money disappear as they get older because they can't star in things anymore at the same level simply because of these, so it's to the point where, and it's not just actors, producers, everyone else, that they're losing money and they know they're losing money in the midst of this. And, catalyzing that to give voice to it would be amazing, but you need some other revenue generating entity to do it. But, imagine being an aging action star right now, right? And realizing they're just destroying your livelihood. They're taking it from you.
Yeah, and their notion is it's all justified. You got on with your white privilege for too long, and this is just proper comeuppance because our new civil rights regime is not about meritocracy or equal access. I'm preaching to the choir, especially in our audience, but it's rather about this new system of kind of racial hierarchy with the putative reason for it being a lot of this mythologizing about past oppression and past oppressors. Not to say that there's isn't plenty in American history, plenty of injustice in American history, including along the racial lines, but it's not merely an overcorrection. It has this whole ideology behind it, and that's a change, I think, from the good old American notion of fair play, to say the least. And it's driven, as you say, in a kind of culturally revolutionary way by a vanguard that's well organized, and you see it in this Hollywood stuff. In that article, they talk about Duvernay, one of the black actresses, who sort of quickly organized a database for writers and workers of color, and sort of worked hand in glove with this new policy at the Academy. And remember, it really was catalyzed by George Floyd, like so much in recent years, the George Floyd killing, and the complaint, the sort of public relations opening of this was the Academy Awards, 4 or 5 years ago, that, Oscars so white epithet. So yeah, it's all very interesting, something to watch. As we've indicated, we shouldn't shed too many tears about Hollywood destroying itself by finally becoming so ideological that it's incapable of producing even interesting art. And it is a huge opportunity, you're right, Matt, for a kind of pirate, would you say, pirate radio approach to creating good and high art in the visual arts. So that's pretty encouraging. It sounds like you can get a lot of talent right now for pretty cheap and try to build something new. So anyone out there listening who's inclined, do it. You can also make a lot of money doing it because there's a hunger in the populace for good art still. The last data point, this is just a technical thing. I hadn't sort of realized this, but it makes perfect sense. Streaming services have upended the business model, I guess, of Hollywood because there's not all these residuals now from reruns and TV rights and everything else. It's all purchased in a package. So it's changed the business of the place too. Well, I think that's enough on that. We wanted to talk about the news of the day, literally today. We record on Wednesday. This is the 26th. You all will hear this tomorrow. Justice Breyer, I was going to say he announced his retirement, but it doesn't look like that's what happened. It looks like someone announced it for him or leaked it for him, whether it was one of his clerks, maybe some Senate staff who'd been in contact with somebody at the White House. Hard to know, but Breyer, it seems to be from Twitter that Breyer did not want to announce his retirement today and is kind of dismayed at its happening. So whenever this sort of thing, this disjunction in narrative tightening up, or that's a terrible way of putting it, it's just confusing. But when you have this disjunction between the actual actor in question and the narrative emerging through the media in Washington, somebody's leaking. We wanted to play with this theory that Seth has, but before we do that, I just will say it's going to make our politics over the next 6 months pretty interesting, to say the least. My suspicion is that Breyer was inclined to do this towards the end of the term, which is pretty standard, and the Biden White House, with its terrible approval ratings, which continues to slide, its insane crisis at the southern border, and Biden's kind of angry demagoguery of late on two bills that he couldn't get passed on voting rights. All of this disaster calls for a narrative change. So I wouldn't be surprised if someone at the White House thought, if Breyer announces in June, it's going to be much worse for us. We just need to pull the Band-Aid off now and let the politics of it play out and start working it. That would be my theory. But Seth, take us away on your parlay theory.
Well, I mean, I sort of thought of this, intuited this, but I think this went through the the universal mind. I mean, I notice a lot of people are kind of referencing this on Twitter. Well, I mean, look, they have to get rid of Biden, but they can't let Kamala Harris take over because she's even worse than he is, and they're both just a total disaster. So they have to move her out of the way, but in a politically nice way. So I think what they'd like to do is push Breyer out. Like they indicated to him, okay, you've had enough time. They can put Kamala Harris on the court. Then they can nominate Hillary Clinton to be vice president. And then Biden can have a convenient stroke or retire. And then Hillary will take her rightful place on the throne. It'll be like this whole counter coup will finally work out. And then everything, I kind of feel like boomer women have had this itch that Hillary has to be president since 1993 or so. I remember back then them saying boy, Hillary's more qualified than Bill. Like she would be great. This has been in the works for 30 years now. Yeah. And the fact that she lost to Trump was just so intolerable and just such an indication of as though the earth started spinning the wrong way. This all has to be put right. And I feel like this might satisfy them. Well, not really, but it would, they would think it would satisfy them for a couple of hours. Mm-hmm. So this is my theory. Now I looked on the predicted betting site to see where Kamala was running for the next Supreme Court justice, and she's down around 2 cents. So it's not clear that. I mean, maybe I've just got a good bet. Maybe I've just got like maybe I'm really onto something.
Yeah, you should put $100 on that right now, Seth.
Well, I put $8 on
it.
It's a real vote of confidence. Yeah.
What is that? What do you get if you win in that instance? I'm no good at this stuff.
Oh, I guess I would get like well, my bet was 4 cents, so I would make 25 times that, I guess. So I guess I would get like a couple $100.
Yeah, this is a funny theory because I agree that there is a weird totemic quality to it, like a symbolism that just drives people insane, supporters of Hillary, insane about her. She's this martyr figure that was somehow sacrificed on the altar of the evil satanic Trump, and now we have to have the resurrection or something. She's also, unlike some of our other favorite hate objects, some of the people that they just lift up there, like idols. We were talking about Biden, who's essentially an empty suit at this point, a bag of bones, and there are others. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is a show woman, but also just an idiot. Like Clinton is legitimately a conniving, sinister, dark force in the world. Like she actually, you go back and you read some of the stuff she was writing before Bill was running for president about erasing the minor category for children so that they can have basically adult level rights, which is of course a recipe for legalizing pedophilia and and handing children essentially over to the care of the state. The way that she talks about womanhood and her own children is just like really ugly and kind of dark, and I wouldn't put it past her to have engineered, again, unlike some of the people that I think are just like Sonia Sotomayor. I hear her talking and I think this is genuinely just a stupid person that has been elevated to this incredible position of power because of the identity politics of our moment. With Clinton, I actually feel like this is somebody that genuinely wants to rule the world and could.
Yeah.
I mean, look, as far as the Supreme Court, I just have one thing to say. I mean, I think Nicole Hannah-Jones should definitely be the nominee. She should be confirmed, be placed on the court. It's her time, and she deserves it.
Yeah. Meanwhile, people like Andrew Sullivan, who, in his own way, with some caveats, of course, has been against wokeism. I mean, his basic tweet was like, Biden, more or less, Biden has promised it will be a black woman, and that's insane. And the response from America has kind of been a meh, basically explicitly excluding a good portion of the population just based on skin color and sex. Yeah, it gets back to our discussion of what the sources of the revolution in Hollywood and everywhere else are. And Biden's political, to defend him in a way, Biden's a political animal and has always gone with the winds of his party, so we shouldn't be surprised at all. And he just decided this would be a political winner for me and would head off some of the identity politics critics because I'm an old white dude. So I'm sure that was an easy decision for him. But yeah, the Breyer-Kamala-Hillary parlay. I must say, Seth, I don't think that's going to happen, but I do like it. I think it's fun. The one maybe caution against my own skepticism I would have is that it is true that Hillary, I forget who put it this way, but Hillary and Bill have kind of popped their heads over the hedge in the last few months. Hillary,
yes, exactly. Like she did that thing where she read aloud her victory speech, her like erstwhile victory speech, and actually started crying during it, like the part where she's talking about going back in time and telling her dead mother, "Don't worry, your daughter will become president." And it's the level of like grandiosity and self-pity and just a sense of the unfairness of the universe because she doesn't get to be the president. Here's the other thing, is they're really hot to go to war with Russia, but they don't think that Biden or Kamala really have the stones to do it.
Oh yeah, that's another good wrinkle.
But the one person who would be happy to go to war with Russia is the woman who like chortled over like having Gaddafi like raped and murdered in the street. Like she loves to kill people. So she would be great. She would be the one to send to have us go to war with Russia with. So I think that's another factor militating for this. I think that by 2023, Hillary Clinton will be the president. I'm going to go on the record with that.
All right. Well, now it's out in the open. Now we can check
Yeah.
it. Yeah. But this is what I mean. Like, she is an actual, evil global supervillain on the level of a Klaus Schwab. And the fact that she hasn't had her turn at the wheel does, I imagine, rankle the rest of the axis of evil.
Klaus Schwab tried Boadicea or one of these world historical figures. I don't know.
I'm kind of I'm like a Boudica stan, actually. I don't know. I'm
guess
a
that's
fan of hers.
All right. I just see her as like mythic.
Yeah. She's archetypal in some way. Yeah, she's Lady Macbeth. That's the one. She's going to end up, after the Republic collapses and the American Empire falls around her ears, she'll just, stand in the rubble, rubbing her hands and crying out, damn spot.
Yeah.
Well, also, isn't the real history probably some kind of factional difference among them, right? There's different cartels here.
Yeah.
So it may be the case that the Clinton cartel senses the weakness of the Obama cartel, and the Obamas don't have anyone else. Kamala's not going to do it. Like, who else do they have to go to bat? I would imagine that there's some rifts there that would be interesting to think about, where these people are figures, obviously with their own volition and agency, but supported by other factions that are warring. And it is weird because for us now, it's almost, it feels too simplistic. It's populism versus a broad elitism that's remarkably unified throughout the world. And you would think, we'd at least have some more visible factions fighting each other. But I kind of get the sense, like the Clintons, she's just so ambitious and world historical that she knows if she waits around long enough, she finds the weakness is there, she can seize power. But who are we to know how the things work behind the curtain?
Wasn't it Clinton that put Breyer in there in the first place? So, they're just like, look, Clinton giveth and Clinton taketh away. It's you're moving out. We need to put Kamala over there. We need that chair. Okay. So I'm sorry you wanted to hold on to it, but now's not your time. They are ruthless. So yeah, I like that idea that there's these different factions. Biden's weak. People even were saying in 2020, gee, maybe they'll stick Hillary back in there and let her run. Who knows? They don't give up.
I think, as long as we're bandying about far-fetched theories, I'd like to propose that the multiple personality disorder is like a big thing on TikTok now. It's the latest social justice craze, and I think they should nominate
identity, right, Spencer?
Exactly. It's the latest protected class. And so I think it's 2022, and it is far past time that America had a multiple personality disorder Supreme Court justice. And if they can get that through, then they can argue that there actually have already always been 20 justices on the Supreme Court. So we don't even need a constitutional amendment.
As long as one of the personalities is a black woman, it's fine, right? I guess.
That's right. It's court packing by another route.
Do all the personalities get a vote? I guess they must, right?
They would. Yeah, that would be the end. They wouldn't address that in the hearing, but then it would be too late.
Oh, man. And look, the other bit of fuel to add to this fire, of course, is the fact that it's going to be a wild June on the court, I think. The abortion case, the affirmative action case. I forget, actually, is the affirmative action case will it be decided by June? I guess it must, right? Or is it going to get pushed to the next term? I forget. I can't. I think it might be next term, but abortion is definitely coming down by June. So it will just add fuel to this fire. In many ways, it'll be interesting to watch because what you'll see is the factions will come out on the left on this, I suspect. And I think the thing to watch, Matt, you're correct, to read in between the lines is the different cabals. So there's the Obamas, the Clintons, and whatever Biden's cabal is. It's sort of a mixed bag because a lot of Biden's administration is former or Obama retreads. So they'd probably be against it, elevating Hillary. But who knows? I mean, you're right. The compelling part about what you say, Seth, is what do you do about Kamala? I mean, you're in a real pickle. Kicking her upstairs to the court, so to speak, solves a lot of problems.
Yeah, because it would insult the Democrat base just to, like, Spiro Agnew her out of there with some kind of scandal or, something like that. That would be, like, grievous. But to make her the first black woman on the Supreme Court, that would be acceptable. That might, like, salve their bad feelings. And then there's always the promise that Stacey Abrams could become vice president next time or something like that.
My gosh. I mean, I guess we should expect something like that. The Harris thing, I mean, it feels to me like Ukraine and so much of what's going on. I mean, this isn't really going to happen, right? I mean, no one wants to do this. This is insane. And you feel like with Harris, the same thing. Like, you wouldn't really do that, would you? Why do we have to talk about such idiots at all? Such people who, zero accomplishments, who really are not talented and just dumb. I mean, just plain dumb. Why do we have to talk about them at all? But, I mean, make a fair point. They don't seem to stop until they're stopped, and they haven't been stopped. So anything's possible, right? I mean, look at what we're doing in every sector right now.
It's weirdly consonant with the Hollywood stuff that we were talking about and the kind of cultural overtake. I thought James's point was worth underscoring, that the cultural ground that these folks are fighting over, the actual space and content, is so played out and so enervated and so sucked dry of new ideas. I watched The Last Duel the other day, and I was thinking, gosh, why do I like this movie so much? It's kind of a Me Too retcon of the historical data. And finally I realized, like, I'm just grading it on a curve because it's a movie for grown-ups. Like, when was the last time that I saw an actual adult story about adult humans? Like, the childishness, the sheer emptiness of so much of the schlock that comes out. And you're right, Matt, it's like, then you have to think about it. Then people are talking about, like, Spider-Man Cubed, and they're talking about all this stuff that we have to suddenly act as if it matters, or indeed we have to talk about Kamala Harris and Sonia Sotomayor as if they were people with brains that, like, are serious and need to be discussed. That in itself is a kind of demoralization tactic, I feel like. It's just this endless barrage of crap that means nothing. And the more we can be thinking about what comes after that, or what we raise in the ashes of its inevitable demise, the better.
So are you giving Ridley Scott's The Last Duel 2 thumbs up, Spencer?
Absolutely. Well, what you do is you watch the movie, which you will enjoy, and then you go read the book, which is only like 200 pages long, and which exposes the movie as a complete fraud. It's like a believe all women parable. The story, nobody knows what happens in this case, and then they turned into, like, the truth of the matter is this woman's rape accusation. Anyway, it's
I see.
It's kind of that in itself is depressing if you go away and read the book.
So what you're saying is it's the expected Hollywood deal these days,
right?
But at least it's not like hyper crazy woke.
Right. And the experience of watching it was funny because it was like, I can tell I like this. I'm enjoying it. And it's not hyper crazy woke. And it's not about, like, lasers flying through the air. It's, like, about actual real people and real problems. And then the whole time I'm like, but something about this is obviously wrong. Like, when you can just feel like they're obviously taking this historical evidence and turning it into their own parable drama, which is like everything now. It's like you guys are right that this was never particularly a place where Hollywood was never particularly a place where conservatives could feel comfortable. It's just now we know that everything breathes hostility.
Remember that Oscars, was it 06 or 07? Maybe it was 08. When the two of the Best Picture contenders were Brokeback Mountain and Crash.
Oh yeah,
and Crash won.
Was that the same one? That was not the one where they gave it to one and then took it back and gave it to another.
No,
right?
that was much more recent.
Later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, Crash was a terrible movie. God.
Oh my gosh. Well, Brokeback Mountain is unreadable. Speaking of books that things are based on,
Unreadable.
the Annie Prue woman is just like functionally illiterate.
Well, on that note,
Sorry.
we need more. No, we need more high art. And as our friend Michael Walsh wrote in his book Fiery Angel, explicitly political art that is written ideologically is never very good. You have to create high art, and high art in its own beauty and nobility in some ways delivers its own political message. But, all right. Well, thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. And if you want to learn more about all our projects and writings, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewbooks.com, and the Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. Please rate us well on Apple iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Share this podcast far and wide. I will say a little update on the guests. I think in 2 weeks, that would be the 9th, I think, we're going to have the great Peachy Keenan on, and then we'll work on a guest for next week. Next week, we won't have Seth because he'll be on his way out here, and maybe Matt might be too. No, Matt will be here in time, so might even be in the studio. Anyway, that should be fun. Maybe we'll think of a guest for next week. Maybe we'll Dragoon Arthur into it, and he can talk a little bit about our work in D.C., and then just have some fun. But anyway, with all that, I should thank the production and engineering crew as well. The great Jake Gannon is out, so Annalisa Lee is in the booth, live and in charge, and chiding me for almost going over time. So thank you all for listening. Talk to you next week.
I mean, maybe I'm wrong.
But maybe not. Outtakes. This is the show.
Yeah, what are you talking about?